Welcome. Today, you've heard about the hundreds of Promise programs serving students and communities throughout the nation and how we can leverage the strengths of these programs and their cross sector leaders and constituents to curb impacts of the pandemic, job loss, and environmental angst and anger. This is what we want to accomplish. We want hardworking students to continue their education and complete their post-secondary certificates and degrees while seeking and securing successful career pathways that give them family wage-sustaining jobs. This session will address how Promise programs can leverage integrated learning and work opportunities for our nation's students, youth, and adults. We'll explore ways to think about the changing labor market, but sadly today, 20 million Americans are on unemployment insurance, many experiencing extreme hardships, like we saw this week with 25,000 cars lined up at the Dallas Food Bank. I practically cried when I saw this. Before COVID-19 swept the country, thousands of these Americans were gainfully employed. We want to help all students, especially working students or out-of-work students. We want them to understand how to take advantage of post-secondary education and training options, what's best for them as they look for work, if they're in a job, as they change jobs, and in general, navigate their careers through the pandemic and post the time when we'll all be safe and sound from a vaccine. Today, we're joined by three terrific leaders who work tirelessly to support post-secondary access and success, especially for low-income, first-generation, and underrepresented students. Bill Moses, the Managing Director for the Kresge Foundation's Education Program. Yolanda Watson Spiva, President of Complete College America. And the Honorable Jim Geringer, former Governor of Wyoming, Board Chair of Complete College America, and Honorary Vice Chair of the College Promise National Advisory Board. I'm Martha Cantor. I'll be moderating, and I run College Promise. Bill, Yolanda, and Jim, would you introduce yourself and tell us about your work on behalf of our nation's students, and then we'll get to the questions.
Hi, I'm happy to go. My name is Bill Moses, as Martha said. I run Kresge's post-secondary program. We have at Kresge a goal of improving the lives of people with low incomes who live in America's cities. At our education work, what we're trying to do is to promote post-secondary access and success for low-income, first-generation, and underrepresented students, particularly African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, communities that often have not fared as well in post-secondary education as we'd like them to. We have three main strategies. The first one is to really help with that transition from high school to college, pathways to college, and also to bring those comebackers, those adults, back into college to finish a degree. The second is to build the capacity of the institutions that serve our students. That's community colleges, that's minority-serving institutions, and it's public institutions. This is where the bulk of all American students go to college. They do a great job in many cases, but sometimes they don't do the job they'd like to do. And so we're trying to build their capacity to enhance student success. And third, what we try to do is we're trying to bring cities together in an urban higher education ecosystem to educate more students. So we're working with businesses, with community colleges, four-year schools, K through 12, human service agencies, transit authorities, philanthropy, all to work together. As we know, many times students go off to college and they have everything taken care of for them. But for students who are close to home and maybe juggling work and childcare, they don't get that kind of support. So we're trying to see if the city could do that together. So that's really what we're trying to do. And I'll now pass it on to Yolanda Watson.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you so much for having me, Martha. I appreciate the opportunity to join this conversation. As you said, my name is Yolanda Watson Spiva. I serve as the president of Complete College America, and we are an alliance of 47 states, institutional systems and consortia of institutions who are all have made the pledge and the commitment to try to close completion gaps and equity gaps in college completion, working toward that 2025 goal of trying to have at least 60% of Americans having some sort of credential of value or a post-secondary credential, whether it's a 2-year degree, a certificate, or a 4-year degree, but something that will allow them to acquire a livable wage. CCA operates under the structure of looking at 4 pillars. Really, it's around purpose, momentum, structure, and support. And in the past, the locus of control was always the student, that we needed to improve the ways that students behave. And certainly we want students to come prepared for college. But what CCA does is tries to make the institution more student ready as opposed to focusing on the student being college ready. And so how does now the institution transform itself, knowing that they're experiencing a different type of student, and the students that Bill Moses mentioned are the same types of students. We are focusing on first generation, low income, and underrepresented students. And so we really, it is our task and our honor to make sure that those institutions understand that they're dealing with a very different student than they had in the early 19th century as they are now in the 21st century, and trying to make sure that they're looking at their structures, their support systems for these students, and helping students come into college with a purpose, but that they're able to guide them along the path toward college completion. So our game changer strategies are what we're best known for, but there are lots of strategies and interventions that we believe are important for institutions to undertake in order to help students to be successful.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you, Martha, for inviting us to join this conversation today. I'm impressed with the number of people who are participating. That demonstrates that there is a keen interest, and hopefully will provide some guidance and some insights into how we can do this. I was one of the founding governors 22 years ago of an organization called the Western Governors University, which has evolved into a complete online institution and has significantly impacted the course of higher education to assure greater probability of success and to do it at a much lower cost. I can come back to that later. I have been part of both Complete College America and College Promise with 2 main thoughts in mind. One is access to a reasonable cost for a higher education degree or certificate, whatever we might call it, post-secondary, whatever. And also the importance of completing that work in a way that can be demonstrated as well as documented. So quite often when people say we want free tuition, I would say, well, free without a degree is not free. What can we do to assure persistence and completion? So I would combine the two together, but then also talk about that the cost of college is not just tuition, because we have to bring the student to the campus rather than the campus to the student, which I think now will change dramatically as a result of COVID and other things. We need to start thinking about learning spaces independent of place and use place where it's appropriate and dramatically affect the probability of completion as well as the lower cost to students. So those are some thoughts that I hope we can at least discuss a little bit today.
So you heard all about the focus on a short-term goal. I think in my view, 2025, we want to get more Americans to get that credential of value. And we want not only short-term to get a job, to get in, but as we know, students are going to change jobs 10 to 20 to 30 times in their lifetimes. So a lot of the research is talking about, vertical as well as horizontal capabilities. And Bill, Kresge has worked tirelessly, the Kresge Foundation, for more than a decade, connecting Americans to higher education and productive careers. That's been your goal, one of your priorities, a big priority for education. Could you tell us about Kresge's strategic priority and outcomes, accomplishments that you're seeing to drive not only local or community-based prosperity and revitalize, especially what we're going to need post-COVID, but also, how to drive state leadership and prosperity so that our country will really have the economic, social, and civic value proposition driving our future prosperity overall through education. Why is this so important for philanthropy?
Well, thanks, Martha. One of the things that's interesting is over about the last dozen years, there's been this goal 2025 was started by Lumina. And most of the large funders in this space, the Gates Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, Ascendium, ECMC, have really galvanized around this goal. And what is our role? How can we help more people get college degrees so they can not only strengthen our global competitiveness and our regional competitiveness, but also have their own chance at the American dream. And we've seen since 2008 college attainment go from 38% of all Americans, or post-secondary attainment. You sometimes use them interchangeably, and it's a little inexact, but post-secondary attainment's gone from 38% in 2008 to 51% in 2019. We've seen this dramatic increase. The challenge has been the equity gaps. We haven't, while everyone is seeing their rates go up, we still see gaps between African Americans, Latinx students, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders in particular, and white students and some Asian students. So how do we get those numbers back up? And that's really been the focus is, we've learned a lot about what works. A lot of the game changers that Yolanda can talk about, or things like online education that governor's talked about. We're seeing that really come into play. And the idea is, how do we keep moving it? How do we keep scaling it for the whole country? One of the things we've seen, for example, is we've worked with our human service agency to see if we couldn't get, or human service team at Kresge, see if we couldn't get human services teams or organizations and community colleges to work together, since they often serve the same kind of students. And how do we make sure that they get not just a job, but a springboard job, a job that allows them an opportunity for growth, for a way to progress? It might mean additional training, but they might have good benefits. They can have a family serving job, a job that really can support their family. Other things we've seen is the Detroit Compact, right in our hometown of Detroit, where they work with business, with higher education, both community colleges and four-year schools, and with philanthropy and human service agencies and with government. See, what can we do to get our community better educated? And they've got very specific goals, including to get to 60% by 2030. We don't think we can make it by 2025, but also to have those equity gaps, so that we can have more of all Detroit participating in the prosperity we seek to have. And I think these are really critical things. And I think that when you have like a state promise or a regional promise, as we have in Detroit, you can really galvanize around that and think, how do we really leverage our community for greater success? And we think it's been really, really effective. And we're very confident that this can go. But of course, COVID-19 has thrown a bit of a wrench into it. But as the governor said, we're seeing online education step in, and there are students for whom this is the only thing they can do. So we think that's critically important.
Thanks, Bill. That was great. Yolanda, up next. Complete College America has just begun its new chapter under your leadership. Tell us how CCA is helping regions and states stay on the completion track and connect completion goals with good jobs for both youth and adults. Bill talked about the 38% going to 51%, but we are behind. We were first in the world a generation ago, and now we're 10th. Tell us about what CCA is doing and what your perspective is.
Yeah, well, I would say it's data, data, data. CCA has been known for being able to track and provide data back to states and systems and help them to understand where their achievement or attainment gaps are. But it's Bill mentioned those equity gaps. It's integrally important that we talk about the equity gaps, because that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. When we look at this COVID-19 environment, for example, we know that Black and Latinx and Indigenous folks have been hit the hardest by the pandemic, whether it's socially, economically, but even health-wise. And so when we think about their life prospects and outcomes, because these are the individuals that tend to be in employment that is at the intersection of face-to-face jobs, unfortunately, that means they would have more exposure to things like a pandemic, and they're more likely to be in lower wage jobs. And so when you talk about attainment, this actually it has more than just personal consequences. It has economic and social mobility consequences, but even health consequences. And so as we think about this, at CCA, being able to share data. We're tracking data in partnership with the National Student Clearinghouse, with the Postsecondary Data Partnership, and helping to democratize data and helping institutions understand how they could access data, and states as well, and utilize it to inform their thinking about how they create policies for students. And so I loved when Bill talked about how they're having their human services folks and their community college folks come together. These types of things happen when we look at data, we look at information that tell us where we can do more and do better. And so for CCA, data is really our sweet spot. That's where we thrive in terms of being able to use it for guidance, not as a punitive measure to tell folks where you're behind, but really to help them, to guide them to where the ball is going and not necessarily where it is today. And so for us, as we continue to partner with states, we're also, because we're focused on structure, when we think about sectors, employment sectors across states, we're always talking with them about, well, how do they engage these various employment sectors on the front end? So in terms of designing the curricula, in terms of looking at the number of credits that are required for graduation, helping them to really revise their policies with that in mind, thinking about how folks will actually interact with the employment sector. And increasingly, as we've been doing work with adult learners, helping institutions understand how prior learning assessments and performance-based funding, especially for adult learners, and bringing them back into the fold can be helpful. And so we're really having conversations. And I think the pandemic, again, has exposed, now that most of America has had the opportunity to be an adult learner, right? They've had to teach their own children and also to work and at home in many respects. And so helping them to understand, for adult learners, their experience is very different in terms of how they are engaging with, they're actively in the employment market, but also they're engaging in an academic enterprise. And so how do we now think about how we engage adult learners differently and take some of the best practices and some of the lessons learned from this time in order to improve the ways that we engage parent learners and adult learners who are in the labor market, but also in the academic market. So those are the conversations we're having across our 47 alliance members of states and consortia of institutions, and really helping them to rethink how they engage with the employment sector on the front end. I talked about purpose, momentum, structure, and support, and I'll just leave it at this part to say that the purpose is really where we focus on making sure students engage with the post-secondary pathway with purpose in mind in terms of what they like to do and how they will navigate through the academic pathways, but also through the employment pathways. But then making sure that the institution is purposeful in terms of the employment sectors that they engage with, so that students will have a direct pathway from college to employment.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. I'm so glad you mentioned parents, because I have to just give a statistic really quickly. We're talking about youth and adults. We're talking about serving all students, all Americans, with more education beyond high school. That really is, I think, a shared mission between all of the panelists here today. Parents make up 40% of the population in community colleges, and parents make up 25% of all 16, 17 million students in American undergraduate education, and a larger proportion in graduate school. So I just think we need to think adults and youth and really adjust accordingly in terms of what we hope higher education will do to really transform what it is doing based on, the kinds of outcomes and research that is available, and sharing data and the rest of it. So Jim, let me turn to you. Wyoming's legislature has been instrumental in building and sustaining the Hathaway Scholars opportunity for every hardworking student in Wyoming to earn a certificate or a degree at a Wyoming community college or at the University of Wyoming. The goal has been, as we've just been saying, to make an education beyond high school affordable and attainable. And the statewide model is financially sustainable, like it is for students in Washington State. We have some sustainable models. We've got Tennessee, Washington State, Wyoming, and others. We've been tracking plus or minus 30 statewide scholarship programs that also many are really supporting wraparounds and other things that Yolanda and Bill are talking about. But we're at a crossroads on reaching our nation's college completion goals, as you all said, the 2025 goal, maybe it'll be 2030. So Jim, can you tell us, Give us your insights on where we go next for the US. How are we going to once again become first in the world for having a college educated, work ready population that's going to drive our economic prosperity, our social inclusion, and our civic leadership and civic engagement in the years ahead?
Well, the Hathaway Scholarship was named after a former governor who was quite an advocate of education, who also set up the opportunity to build permanent funds in Wyoming, the income off of which, without expending the permanent part, we would use just the income earned off of that. And a portion of that is dedicated to the Hathaway scholarships so that it's not dependent upon annual appropriation. It's there, and that provides it some sustainability. The scholarships are both merit-based and need-based, and there are requirements for students to maintain adequate progress as they progress through. So there's several features there that represent what an individual state can do, and I would emphasize that the successful college promise programs that are out there have that kind of an approach. They're tailored to their community, to the region, to the state, and they're based upon what the needs are as well as the abilities are of that support that they have. The persistence through college, though, is one of the key things that I think we ought to talk about. The opportunity that we can do, take the most of the opportunity that the coronavirus, the COVID thing has brought upon us, moving to online education, which several institutions have done well. Probably just as many, if not more, have not done well, but it has demonstrated that there are other ways to deliver the type of certification or college completion that we're after. Instead of being, well, higher education holds time constant and lets learning vary. We need to hold learning constant and let time vary. Learn independently of time and place and get credit for what you know, not how many hours you spent in a seat in a classroom. So let's just rethink higher education and its business model and deliver something that's more affordable to the students and of higher quality at the same time. I urge higher education to consider that. You can do better for less if you'll change your business model and your delivery. Now, one of the essential parts of that is coaching of the students so that they are prepared as they matriculate, as they start college, and as they progress through, that they have constant contact with somebody who cares about them. We've demonstrated that at Western Governors. Every student has contact with a coach or a mentor or a subject matter expert at least twice a week to encourage them. Their average time to completion is 2.5 years. Their average debt is less than $10,000, counting everything. That's a pretty dramatic approach. We're not unique, but it does depend on online. And as we've learned with both K-12 and higher education, not everybody has access to online that's adequate. That will challenge us as a nation, but it can dramatically increase the opportunity for learning. But now, colleges, you need to change how you do assessment. Give the student credit for what they know based on an assessment that's designed to measure what they know or their competencies. That way, you'll give them credit as early as it's due. And don't say, well, if it wasn't studied on our campus, we can't transfer your credits, or we have to charge you for a quiz-out course because we need the tuition money. Frankly, the student needs it worse than you do. So get a new business model. That's my advice. Higher education, take a fresh look. We have millions of people, probably close to that 20 million you talked about, Martha, that have some college and no degree because they can't get credit for what they know, either through work experience or other knowledge opportunities. Redesign your assessment process, redesign how you grant a degree, come up with ways to grant interim credentials that are stackable. By stackable, that means if you get a certification in IT that allows you to work for a certain company, but now you want to go back to college, you should be able to get credit for that toward the accomplishment of a degree. Higher education doesn't typically allow that. Change your model. So that's my admonition. If we want to increase our attainment and our success and meet employer needs, which is another question, how many institutions really do seek out what the employer expected of a student and track that student and that employer satisfaction over time? It's possible, even under the FERPA requirements, as it's referred to in its acronym. So I'm giving a little bit of a lecture to the lecturers here today because I can see a way for you to do it.
Thanks, thanks a million, Jim. I'm going to ask you to teach an online course so you can tell everyone in the world how to reform their institutions, increase efficiencies, and improve quality for better outcomes, because our country needs a more educated, workforce ready population. That's just the bottom line. And so we have about a few more minutes for it. One more question of all of you. I'll ask a question of all of you, but I want to say one thing to the audience, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And this will be live streamed in perpetuity. So if anyone wants to go back and see what any of our panelists have said, it'll be public information through lots of different channels. What we do have, though, is a whole set of resources from the Kresge Foundation and also from Complete College America and College Promise. So I'm really excited for you to access those resources, and they're available to you through the chat function on your Zoom. And we also want you to ask us questions. So please put your questions in the chat.
Martha, I see there's a question from Savannah Toey. Can we respond to that one?
Okay, it says, I'm working in an agricultural town in northern Colorado. Since we are near Wyoming and have similar small town layout in our county, how would you suggest meeting the unique needs of these rural students who can be more challenging to reach? That's even a better question maybe than the one I was going to ask. So why don't we have who wants to take it first, second, and third? We want to have a dialogue. So who would like to weigh in first?
Well, since Wyoming was invoked, let me give a quick response. Rural students are challenged very similarly to urban students in terms of having access to such conveniences or necessities as broadband. You have to have connectivity to make a lot of this future-looking work go forward. So the opportunity to have access to additional learning, regardless of place, needs to be emphasized. So states need to take the leadership in providing broadband access not only to the rural areas, which are significantly short, but also a lot of our urban areas, which might have a 5G mobile network, but if you don't have access to it and you can't afford it, you've got to have some other way to have that opportunity. So I challenge states to look at both rural and urban. The opportunity to learn has to be presented. So equity of opportunity is as important as, say, equity of cost and equity of learning. That's where I would start, is extend that capability, but also higher education institutions need to be willing to work with students regardless of where they are. And for the average student today, already having a family, having a job, well, maybe hoping to have a job, they can't leave home. So don't require them to come to your place. Seek them out where they are and then make that available to them, and work with the high schools to increase the amount of dual credit courses so they can progress toward a degree that much more quickly, and as well as graduate from high school on time and be prepared for college.
You know, you're making a point, Jim, that I love, because having been a college president for 16 years, I can't do it online. I just can't. And I would trot out digital chemistry that was a partnership we had with UC Berkeley. If digital chemistry can be taught to meet the chem requirement for science and technology students, we've got to stretch ourselves, and this COVID-19 gives us some new opportunities. So I'd love Bill and Yolanda to weigh in on the rural issue, the broadband. I don't know. I do know that Comcast has had this program, which we actually were part of. They pilot tested it for any low-income family in the country to have access to broadband for $10 a month for high-speed internet. And we were able to get students laptops and the rest of what they need. They can't just get the access to broadband. They need to learn to use the tools and be able to get in. So I want to give a shout out to one of our panelists today, David Rust over in Buffalo, because COVID-19 hit. And I called him up and said, what are you doing? And he said, we pivoted to delivering food to people and getting broadband access hotspots put in. And then I went over to San Antonio to Mike Flores and I said, what are you doing? And he said, what we're doing is we've made every parking lot high-speed internet, because we can't have in classroom lab, except for the high-end labs where you have to have hands-on training. I mean, you can't fix an engine without getting your hands dirty. But for most of the classes, something like 90%, 95% in Dallas and San Antonio and many schools around the country, we're using some COVID money to at least get hotspots available. But we have got to have broadband as a minimum to every community in the country. So tell us, maybe Yolanda and Bill and Jim, how are you responding to the impacts of COVID-19 with the populations that you're serving, Complete College America, institutions and states, Kresge, pretty much everything from local communities to states to, the national agenda you have. We've got health and safety challenges because of COVID, but at the same time, we have such an opportunity for innovation and in some cases reform. And I asked the question, how can we increase quality, being more efficient, and with the right accountability? And that's a huge tall order. So Jim, Bill, Yolanda, why don't we start with you, Bill, and go to Yolanda and then
Sure.
Go to Jim.
So I think it's great. And I think what Jim just brought up about, and you brought up, Martha, about internet connectivity, this was, I think, seen for a lot of people as kind of a luxury or something that you don't really need to survive. But obviously today you have to have internet connectivity. You can't get healthcare, you can't get diagnosed in many cases in some communities right now of any kind of illness if you don't have access to the internet, because there's no way to see a doctor. And I think we're at an interesting inflection point. The Rural Electrification Act of 1936 was passed at the height of the Depression, or shortly after the absolute peak, as a way to respond directly to this, to make sure that people all over America had access to electricity. And I think this is a way, when we're so divided as a nation, to bring cities and rural areas together, to have something akin to a Rural Electrification Act, but something about high quality, low cost, affordable broadband for everyone, so that students can go to school, whether they live in rural Alaska, where I'm from, or they live in New York City. We know people are suffering and not able to access that. What we're doing is we're looking at things, for example, in Michigan, they took some of the CARES Act and created something called Futures for Frontliners. And they basically said this is a GI Bill, kind of modeled off of Tennessee Reconnect, but a GI Bill for people who are serving in the front lines in the springtime, in that first COVID peak. Since October, when it was announced, and what we've done is we've been doing outreach funding. So we're funding commercials. They've had 90,000 Michiganders, or Michiganians if you prefer, but Michiganders sign up to get access to 2 free years of tuition at a community college, so they can get that certificate or that associate degree and really have a chance to get a different kind of career, a different kind of life for themselves. And I think this is critically important. We're also seeing, one of the things we're looking at is how can we make colleges, as Governor Geringer was saying, more responsive to the needs of their students. So we've been working with a competitor of Western Governors University, which is Southern New Hampshire University, and Thurgood Marshall College Fund, to develop a way for historically Black colleges and universities to provide online courses. These are often very expensive to produce initially, and so the idea is, could they work together to provide courses that HBCUs could use, whether they're in Delaware or they're anywhere else in the country, so you can get that wonderful supportive, nurturing experience of an HBCU, but maybe have it online. So you could do it in the evenings as you're trying to maybe get ahead and trying to make yourself more competitive in the labor market. So we see these are, really important. And we've also seen, actually, in another grantee, Georgia State, where because they had so much data on their students, were able to quickly pivot online. And they found that because their students weren't working in the springtime, they actually had better GPAs. And so it raises this issue of how do we, as the governor said, how do we cover the whole cost of an education, not just tuition, but all the other ancillary costs of getting ahead?
Thanks, Bill. What do you think about all this? What about COVID-19? Where are we going? How are we going to deal with broadband? What are you seeing, Yolanda?
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple of thoughts, especially to the question from the person asking about rural education. I think what I've seen in communities that have done it best are when there are public-private partnerships. And so we, I think you invoked Washington State earlier. As you know, I used to work in Washington State, and especially because the east side of Washington is very rural. The ways in which corporations in Washington State have and continue to come alongside the educational system to make sure that a lot of the needs get met. What I've seen across the nation, Wisconsin and Oregon, Washington State, some of these places where the major companies who are in those states are actually having college on their premises. So a lot of their workers can actually take post-secondary courses on their premises. So when the governor Geringer talks about place, right? So it's place agnostic. It doesn't matter, but you can actually be at work, stay at work an extra hour or so and take your course or come a little bit earlier or go during your lunch break. Those sorts of things help in terms of that. We also saw during the pandemic where a lot of places, colleges didn't close down per se, but there was a lot of perception that colleges did because many of them were still operating on analog lines. So when a student called the school, there was nobody there to answer because the voicemail wasn't in the cloud or digital. And so I think a lot of, when you talked about, Bill, that this is not a luxury, even for institutions having to rethink their infrastructure to realize, wait, we weren't ready for this. So not only were students not prepared or capable, but we as organizations or institutions weren't ready. And so thinking about how now they retrofit their systems and infrastructures so that if there is not just a pandemic, it could be a hurricane or some other natural disaster that could knock the system off of the grid. How do we continue to operate? And so we've seen these factories opening up their businesses to have classes on the campuses. We've seen high schools open up in ways that are recognizing, again, parents as learners as well as traditional students as learners, and how do they partner with these we had a number of companies as well as these utility companies to open up their Wi-Fi, especially in rural areas, so that basically, whereas before you would have to have passwords to get on, everybody opened up their Wi-Fi so that no matter where you were able to travel in rural areas, you were able to access. So I think it really was a whole community response. And when you have everybody understanding what the needs are and then looking at what they have, what can they contribute to resolve the problem, those whole community responses have really been the lifeblood of not just what happens during an emergency, but I would say the best in class who do this are doing that even when it's not an emergency. They're really leaning in to make sure that their community can be supported and educated, even with meager resources.
Exactly. I mean, I don't think that is what we're trying to do in College Promise. Bring the community together, bring the leaders together, and have the cross-sector fertilization, because education can no longer be in a silo. We have to connect partners, and we have to do vertical and horizontal in so many different ways. And that's why I love what I'm seeing around the country in these 330 local promise programs and states. I mean, Tennessee is not Washington State, but they both have big promise agendas. Look at Wyoming that Jim has talked about, New York, California, I mean, you name it, Kansas. So Jim, do you want to weigh in on this question also?
There's just so many things. I think one of the greatest things that the COVID has caused as a change is the realization that things are not going to be the same. But for the people who are out of work or struggling to even get by with what they have as work, they need something that has a sense of urgency to it. So that the sooner they can find an opportunity to work, the better off they are. Now, how do we get them back to work? Well, if the average time to a college degree is at least 6 years, that ain't going to work. There has to be a way to help them get their credentials up to date or to meet some employer expectation. What are we doing to advance that? Community colleges are probably best prepared to do that. How can we assure that that happens? If you can't get to a campus, can you do it online? Can we improve how delivery is done online? You don't just conform what was done in the classroom and put it online. That won't work. The first thing you have to redesign are your assessments. Today, most colleges are giving pass-fail credit. They're not doing graded exams. Well, any exam ought to be proctored if you want to give some substance to what that student knows. There's a lot of technology advances out there that higher education can take advantage of, but they need to design it. Well, I'd put it this way. Don't just conform to what technology can do. Conform technology to what you need to do. So the first thing is you have to decide, what am I going to do? What's my mission? That's to deliver a credential or degree to this student. How can I utilize technology to do that? And how can I use technology differently than I ever have before? primarily for delivery to create learning opportunities, and then to assess the demonstration of that competency and to give credit for what the student knows outside of your organization. That all those things taken together respond to the call for urgency so that the students actually feel that they're progressing toward a meaningful opportunity and can get back to work, can save their business, can do something for their kids without having to travel to some remote campus. So technology is a great enabler, but don't misunderstand it and just think that you can automate something you've always done.
Well, Jim, I'm going to put you into any number of Coursera or any number of the online programs because you're coming up with such great advice for colleges and universities, for city leaders, for state executives, for the government, the federal government. I have 20 more questions to ask all of you, but we only have 3 minutes left. So, could you take a half a minute? And Bill, could you give us some quick advice to the audience? What's one thing they can do from your perspective, whether they're leading a college, working in a nonprofit, social media expert, maybe they're maybe they are on the ground, maybe they're a parent. We have a huge numbers of people that are seeing these webinars. So go ahead, Bill, and then I'll go to Yolanda, Jim, and then I'll wrap.
So thank you, Martha. So I think if you don't mind, I'll have sort of a twin thing. The first thing is I would say, if you're working on things like College Promise, just make sure that this is sustainable. It is a promise. You're trying to engage students with the hope that they can get an opportunity that will change their life. So make sure that it's financially sustainable. But the other thing is, I think, is building on what Governor Geringer said, is take advantage of this moment. We know it's been terrible. But there have been times when the COVID opportunity has allowed us, for example, to speak in 2 or 3 different cities in the same day, or to engage with people we would never otherwise be able to see. And so think about what could we take from what we've been doing in this emergency that we would want to use in the future, both lessons learned and even things that we've been doing. I think that's really critical.
Thanks, Bill. Yolanda, take away one piece of advice.
Yeah, and I'm going to cheat and do two. So one, I just think we need to stay ready. I think, we always talk about reform, 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 but then when the opportunity comes, we're afraid to make the reforms. So when Governor Geringer talked about these bold ideas, we've been talking about this, and yet there's this hesitancy to implement. So I would say to stay ready, but then be ready to deploy when the time comes. And we're in that moment now. Lastly, I would say listen to students, ask students the questions, listen to students because they actually have the best solutions for us. They will tell you everything you need to know to help you get to the right answer.
Great advice. Jim, 30 seconds. We're in the countdown.
A dream accomplished with someone else that you're close to is more meaningful than ever. Business partnerships, work with employers, work with funders. Don't expect someone else to do it. And don't wait for the federal government to do it. Look how long that could take. Goodness sakes. Work within
Thank you,
your state
Jim.
and your community. That would be my number one advice. Don't let the virus get you down. Get a sense of purpose and don't give up.
Thanks a million. Thanks to all of our panelists. You were fantastic. Next up, you're going to hear from Dallas College student leaders talk about student voices. So listen to our students. They belong to the quote, "We Belong in College" campaign. And several of our Promise program leaders are going to be part of that panel in our career life cycle sessions. Thank you all for joining us. And thanks again to the panelists.